We're glad that you could join us for our podcast called And Also, a podcast for the rest of the week. In it, Kirk, Steigler, and I are going to be dialoguing about the previous week's message, and we want to just kind of bring another voice into the room. So if you listen to the previous week's message at Faith Alliance Church, if you haven't, you can catch it at faithall.org. They're all there for you, but last week's message is there, and you can watch that or listen to it, and then dial into this podcast, having a conversation rather than a monologue, being able to hear another perspective, uncovering those to have a deeper dialogue, not only with one another, but we want to invite you into the process to think deeply and well about our culture and think deeply and well about the scripture. So we hope you enjoy. All right, so we are here, wherever here is for us, since we're doing this on Zoom, for our fourth episode of And Also, a podcast for the rest of the week. And I can actually say, as always, since it's been 4 episodes, and as always, I'm joined with Kirk Steigler, and glad to again be connected and do this, where we talk about just a little bit of a deeper dive into the passage for the week, a little bit deeper dive into the sermon from the previous week. So if you are interested, you can go to faithful.org and catch the previous week's message that was preached on the 14th of January. And we're just going to talk about the series itself on riches. We're going to talk about the passage itself and the themes that come out from it, and just, again, take a little bit of a deeper dive. But not only is it Kirk and I, we also have a special guest. So Kirk's going to introduce our very special guest, not just a special guest, a very special guest.
Very special. So today, joining us all the way from, we're on YouTube, so it could be anywhere, but all the way from North Carolina. Previously from...
Oh, y'all.
Yeah, please don't do that. But previously from Salem, Massachusetts, previously from Glendale, Rhode Island, previously from Fall River, Massachusetts, and then previously from Barnstable, Cape Cod, Reverend Ken Steigler, who will say hello or something.
Hello.
There.
It's great to be on this. Great to be on this podcast. Thank you very much.
We look forward to hearing insights from you too. So this is my dad, for those of you who are listening at wherever you're listening.
We thought that one Steigler wasn't enough, so we had to bring 2 of them on.
Steigler squared.
Yeah. Oh, that's a terrible situation. That's right. That's good. And there might be a
Don
little
has been out
here.
Steiglered. Yeah.
Did you say I've been out Steiglered? Is that what?
Yeah. Look out.
Well, Ken, do you mind just sharing a little bit about your background? You've been a pastor for a long time, and just kind of a little bit about who you are, and then we'll go ahead and talk about the passages so that people who might be listening who don't know you know a little bit more about you.
Okay, I'm ordained United Methodist pastor. I have served in a number of churches, as Kirk just mentioned, various places. One of the most interesting places, of course, was in Salem, Massachusetts for 16 years. Now we've been 17 years here in North Carolina, and I serve a United Methodist Church as a pastor for intercessory prayer teams. I serve as a pastor for a Southern Baptist Church in the afternoon from 4 to 5 every Sunday afternoon. I preach and teach there. And I do Christian counseling. That's one of the things that I do is I'm the head of the Wake Forest Pastoral Counseling Service, and do counseling mostly with people who are caught up in occult and people who are in depression or suicidal, that kind of thing. Kirk is a great son, and I'm so proud to be on this podcast. Thank you for welcoming me.
I'm glad I made it all the way to great son out of all your sons. I'm so proud. I'm number one son. Oh wait, I'm the only son. Yeah. but still good. Sounds great.
That makes it great.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Being in the will of God is the most valuable thing that you can be in, because in
Hmm.
living in the will of God, the thing about if we're talking about riches, the thing about value in riches is that the most valuable thing is the thing that makes other people rich, not monetarily, but that when something that is valuable makes other people valuable, that's real and true value. So the will of God, I talked about the will of God being alchemy, that it changes substances. So even in the middle of very difficult times, when you're in the will of God, it can transform your situation. So it makes going through difficult things, if you're in the will of God, uh, bearable and valuable in and of itself. So is there a sense of that, where even going through difficult times, you saw the value of just being in the will of God and doing what He had called you to do?
Probably the most dramatic uh, story I can tell from being in Selma, working with Dr. King and working with the team there. We came in I coordinated the buses, two buses from Harvard, Andover, Newton, and BU, and we went down as clergy. Dr. King, after Bloody Sunday, needed clergy with collars, so that it was really obvious that when they were being stoned or whipped or beaten, that you're beating clergy persons. So we filled up two buses at his call, Dr. King's call, and we came down, the first night that we got there, we thought we were going to see everybody in wheelchairs and crutches, and nope. People were praising God, they were worshiping, and we got there, we went right into a worship service, which lasted about 3 hours. And after all day from way early in the morning to to down, we were really tired. So we had to get people into beds. So some went to different churches and slept in the pews. I was privileged as the coordinator to be with the pastor, but some had to go to Afro-American homes, Black folks' homes. And so we just divvied up the teams, and the next morning they came back, and the people who were in the homes had where they stayed, their houses were shot out by the Ku Klux Klan and rednecks in the night at about 2:30 in the morning, syncopated to terrify the clergy that were there in the houses, and blew the first floor of the houses with bullets. Nobody was killed, but they were all ready to go. I ran over to Dr. King and Martin. I said, "Please, they're ready to leave. The whole gang is ready to leave." So he came over with the newspaper, which had the headlines and a picture of all of us getting off the two buses, and the headline said, "Northern agitators arrive." And then he spoke for about 45 minutes. And here's the title of his message: "You can't get dirty laundry clean without agitation." And then he quoted one prophet after another, how the prophets were agitators. And agitators work from within the system to try and bring justice, righteousness, and holiness into the system, as opposed to what I call instigation. They're instigating a lot of art anarchy, as opposed to agitating for change through the system of laws and good manners and love and peace. So what we learned to do was, in the face of all that, we learned how to protect one another. They were calmed down. The group was calmed down. We were able to stay there for the rest of the week. They were ready to go, but we stayed for the rest of the week and learned how to cover one another and protect one another. We walked out during the daytime in groups of 10 because we couldn't go more than that. That was a parade. So we were in groups of 10, and we were black and white, and then white and black and white. So we were totally an integrated group going in, got to the courthouse, and learned that the Afro-Americans had to speak, Black people had to speak in either Italian or Russian or French or German to read the books that they were handing them. They couldn't read those things, or quote the entire Constitution, which was just, anyway, if you were white, you walked in and read Dick and Jane, and if you were not, you had to do these fantastic linguistic tricks to read in other languages or know the Constitution. So that was a great learning, and the people we walked with were very appreciative of who we were, and we were very thankful to walk with them and not be killed. I mean, really, literally, not to be killed. And one day we were wrapped in plastic, and they were yelling at us, "Oh boy, they're already wrapped in plastic. Get them now." So it was very, very intense. And when you're in that intense situation, you've got to know that you're trusting Jesus and that your life is worth living for him and surrendered to him, and that what you're doing is bringing the gospel of love to a situation that was very inflammatory and very evil.
So, actually, Kirk, back to what you said. Thank you for that, Ken, because that not that it plays directly into the passage, Kirk, that you mentioned earlier. It may have been actually before we started recording, so I'll reread the passage. But Kirk, you had mentioned. I have to find the passage again. Having a
Verse
good
17, that was it?
Yeah, I'll start at the end of 16. I'll just read 16 and then into 17. Having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. But then the specific passage, for it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. So no, you're talking about the preposition that I kind of focused on, then doing evil. But the reality is that for is important, and I think what's really helpful in these conversation is the particularity to language, and that for changes the meaning almost entirely. That suffering for doing evil is different than doing evil. The for adds the meaning to the suffering part. But anyway, Ken, as you were talking, that passage kind of was highlighted for me. It's better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. And I can imagine that they were both involved, God's will and suffering. So I don't know, Kirk, if you wanted to. Again, I don't know if it directly connects to what you had said before, but I wanted to bring that passage in.
Well, it made me think of something else that you had said earlier today too, where you talked about fear, where you had talked about fear is a helpful instinct. I'm sure, Dad, you felt the fear at moments like that where you're like, oh man, this is it. This is pretty intense. But, we all talk about fear with a fight or flight instinct. You had mentioned, fear freezing you up, right? So people can become either frozen in fear, or they can become panicked and run in fear. Or they become enraged and want to strike back out of fear, just in panic and self-preservation, right? And you couldn't do that during that situation, right? That's not an option. And it's interesting to imagine being in a moment of such intensity. It's hard to imagine yourself in such a situation and then understand what your reaction is going to be. So, and then how do you can trust, you can say you trust, and then that's kind of the moment. I am trusting, right? Because that's it. You're up against it. That is the end. It's real or it's not. So it's fun to clap along in church. And right, but then when the moment comes, right, the real moment comes. Like we're recording this on Valentine's Day, right? This is Valentine's Sunday. Valentine was beheaded, right? By what was it one of the emperors anyway? But he was beheaded, and it wasn't so romantic. He faced it head on. He was a bishop, right? He was a local bishop, and he faced it, and then lost his head. That was how that went. So, yeah, Peter talks about living a life that even if people start to slander you, that they have nothing really substantial to say because there's nothing to be ashamed of. You're living, as you read, it's better to suffer for doing good than to suffer, for doing evil. You've lived a life. You are living a life. Times are wild right now here, but you're living a life as best you can in the way that God had set out for you. That even when people start to speak against you, or you're under the microscope, which no one ever likes to be, and the situation's intense, that you can still sit back and trust and just keep on going.
Well, yeah.
And yeah, finding that moment of being able to trust and relax in that situation, despite the intensity.
Well, and interesting too. You said, the passage where it says, give a reason for the hope that is in you. You have to do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, um, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. And so, while people work to put you to shame, reviling, slandering, I mean, that's intense language. The reality is, it's them who are put to shame for trying to do the very thing that they're trying to have you do. They're trying to put you to shame, but the scripture says they'll be put to shame because they won't be able to find anything of substance, because you're suffering for the will of God. So, Kirk, you brought up a good point, about the difference between clapping in church and when the rubber meets the road, like where real life happens. And I think, honestly, maybe unfortunately, I think that's a that can feel like 1,000 miles apart, where we can say, and even for me, I can say all the right things on a Sunday morning, but then on a Monday afternoon, if my faith is being tested, respond differently. Where Ken, when you're talking about your story, that's when the rubber meets the road of faith, where faith becomes very real. And instead of responding in fear, fight or flight, like Kirk said, there's a reality to stay within God's will and have to suffer. And in some cases, like you said, be ready to give your life for it. And so, how do you, I guess, how do we help people to, who are clapping on Sunday, learn to live out the reality of faith on Monday? Whether it's standing up for injustice, or whether it's even something minor that happens at work on a Monday afternoon. How do we help kind of move those two distances, clapping on a Sunday morning to the reality of faith on a Monday? How do we help kind of close the gap on that?
I don't know. Personally, for me, it's a lot of little steps, right? Just like when you're
Oh,
learning anything, it's a lot of little steps. So it could be, you've clapped in church, and then you're pulling out of the parking lot and you get cut off on the road, just pulling out of the parking lot, and then what's your reaction? Just observe your reaction. Is it immediately like rah, or is it oops, or like, well, okay, just take a moment here, um, and building from there. It sounds like, Dad, you didn't have that kind of time, but you know, while we're not presently in some sort of revolution, it would be nice to everyone take a moment and engage themselves a little bit.
well, is that that's a good point. Like, maybe you don't go from 0 to 100 right away, but Ken, is that the path toward being able to say, okay, I'm willing to suffer because I'm in God's will. I'm doing what He's called me to do, and I'm willing to give my life for it. Is it 100 small things like Kirk's talking about, or is there something else that's
Well, when I was in Selma, I had to leave to come back and remarry my mother and father for their 25th wedding anniversary. I was 23, and they wanted me to remarry them. I remarried them, and the next morning drove back to Marston's Mills, where we were living. When I drove up to the parsonage, lo and behold, all of our belongings were out in the front yard. And I learned from the trustees that they didn't want a morgnig for their pastor. Now, I never had heard that, though I worked on the used car lot, but I never heard that term. Took me back by just a little teeny bit, all my belongings out there. So I called the district superintendent, who called the bishop, and the bishop set a council meeting for that night with the church people coming together I was not to go. I would stay in the empty house with all my belongings out of the front yard. And I don't know what was said. The district superintendent wouldn't tell me. The people would never tell me what was said. But whatever the bishop said, the bottom line was, when the district superintendent called me, he said, "Well, the bishop has said you're not leaving until they love you." And so, yeah, right. So now I stayed in the house. They came and put back everything in the house that night at about 9 o'clock. We went out to dinner. They wanted to treat me to dinner late, but it was good to start rebuilding the trust. Huh. And it took about 2 full years to rebuild the trust, which was those little increments that Kirk was talking about, little by little, to see that I was going to be a pastor who was not backing away, but being loving and being forgiving and working with the young people. We had a group of about 60 young people from the community, and that folks could see I was really serious about working a good work for Christ's sake, biblically, in the community. So it took about 2 years to do that. And so that was the reconciliation. And it was the bishop, but the bishop, who was the authority, made it very clear that they needed to love me, and I wasn't going to move until they loved me. So that was very helpful to have that kind of power leverage that he issued, an executive order, and it made it somewhat easier. But it did take 2 years of listening and loving and asking for forgiveness if I offended, and we had to work through that more nig stuff. And in Mashpee, Massachusetts, right near where we were, there was a Ku Klux Klan, and the Ku Klux Klan folks had gotten a hold of the letter that I sent from Selma to the church, and they said that you can't have that kind of a pastor in this area. He's terrible. Anyway, so that they influenced them. And so we had to work through that too with the Ku Klux Klan right in Mashpee, Massachusetts. So it was interesting time, but a time willing to suffer, willing to do whatever it took, even if we had just had to pack up and move, whatever it was, to say that this was a godly thing, a Christ-like thing. And for my walk in faith, this was something that God had called me to do on their behalf. And that's when it came back at me. It wasn't on their behalf, but then they could finally see that it was okay, that I was there on their behalf. But it took 2 years to get to that point.
I just like the fact that the bishop said he won't leave, or we can't make him leave till you love him. And they immediately said, let's take him to dinner. How fast can we get him out? Dinner it is.
That was the good night.
2 years. That's great.
Well, Ken, on reflecting about, and again, you're telling an incredible story in a very short period of time. So I don't want to minimize any of this, but I talk about the tension in First Peter between suffering, but then also like the almost the willingness to suffer because Christ is so good, and the will of God is so incredible that it doesn't minimize our suffering. It's not like by being in the will of God our suffering is minimized, but we, the will of God is so good that when we look at his will and we know that we're in his will, suffering takes on a whole new meaning. And correct me if I'm wrong, but as I'm hearing you reflect, you're talking about some very serious things and some very serious suffering, not only being in Selma and having to endure that, but then 2+ years of having to win back the trust of a congregation that threw your stuff out on the lawn. I can't even, if I came home from vacation and my stuff was out on the lawn because my church people were angry at me, I don't even know what I do. And so as I hear you reflecting, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like there's just a lot of value in doing and responding to God and standing up for righteousness and justice. And that it's kind of like, I had to endure these things. Like I had to go through these things, and I'm sure they were terrible, but I had to go through these things. But standing up for what was right, following God's will in what is right, was much more the priority.
Absolutely, right out of First Peter. Yes, absolutely.
Well, yeah, and he said in First Peter 1, he says. He talks about the untarnished, imperishable inheritance that we've been given, and then he kind of throws this line where he says, "And you've had to suffer for a little while." And these people were being hunted by Nero, and he kind of there's this little line about it. And I know you've had to suffer for a little while, but have you seen the imperishable, untarnished inheritance found in Christ. And I can't get over that balance that, it's actually kind of this not imbalance, but I guess more appropriate balance that he gives, where the reality of Christ is so large that you're being hunted, and yes, you're going through this terrible thing, but have you seen the imperishable inheritance that Christ has given you? And I've been kind of, I guess, haunted by that reality the last few weeks as I've been looking at this book. And then I'm hearing you talking, I'm like, that's kind of what it sounds like that's what you're saying. Unless I'm wrong, but it sounds like that's what you're saying.
Yes. That's you nailed it. You nailed it, John. That's exactly right. Yep. Yeah, and I can laugh. It wasn't laughable at the time, but now I laugh looking back, saying, only God. I mean, only God could have worked all that through. Only God.
Oh, yeah. That's incredible. Yeah, just real, and again, just thinking about the distance between, the clapping on Sunday, like Kirk said, and then the reality of what does it actually mean for us to live out our faith. And sometimes it's inconvenient, but then sometimes, like what you're talking about is the extreme reality where you're ready to give your life for it. And I've never had to face that, but just the seeing Christ is more valuable, is greater. Doing the will of God, being in righteousness, fighting for righteousness is better than having to endure suffering for a little while, like Peter says. That's
even being up
and
against.
I throw in John too.
Right?
What's that?
Well, I didn't go into Salem about the knife in my forehead, all kinds of stuff. But it's when you pass over to really surrendering, then the other opportunities that you have with guns and knives and death threats and all that kind of stuff that happened in Salem. And anyway, when you pass through to the other side, where you say, no matter what, this is how I'm going to live, and no matter what it costs, it makes it easier to face one thing after another like that, death threats and stuff. It just makes it easier to say, well, I'm going to do what God has said. I'm going to stay and pray for those who consider me to be their enemy. I'm going to love them and pray for them and pray God move in their lives in a powerful way to transform them. And if I die, I die. And that's just God's will. I've got to just live in God's will.
That's incredible. Kirk, what were you going to say? You started to say something.
No, I was going to remind him of those scenarios, so that's exactly it. That's exactly it. Coming up against, moving to a new place and hitting a wall of opposition, like intensely and immediately, and then just we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. Just keep plugging away and see the results.
Huh.
Yep. The machete in the front yard and the knives in the doors. There was a whole lot of stuff that was inconvenient, but that's how you had to stand. You just had to stand there, be loving and forgiving.
Well, I consider it inconvenient when my car won't start. I've never thought about a machete in my yard as inconvenient. I haven't gotten to that level yet.
How you get there?
There's still time.
Yeah, you got loads of time. No problem.
Well, I think one thing, it's interesting. One thing that keeps coming up the last few weeks, Kirk's brought it up a number of times, and Ken, you just mentioned it too, is that idea of surrender. That really a lot of this comes down. Trust is the ability to surrender into something or someone else, and that when we trust that the will of God, that the riches of Christ are better, and we can surrender into that, then I just love how you talk about that. And what's wonderful is that when you talk about here's what really matters, the will of God, righteousness, and here's what suffering, which still not minimizing, not diminishing it, but this might happen, I might die, this you said if I die, I die. There's this, I think that's a real and true biblical balance of really seeing the true value riches of Christ, but then hey, this might happen, and I think it comes through surrender, being able to trust that what Christ is doing is of the utmost value, and that we can trust him to lead us into whatever it is we're facing, whether Salem or Selma or so on. In fact, if you write a book, you should name it From Salem to Selma,
or vice versa,
or from Selma to Salem. You could write, that could be your biography's name.
Too late.
Well, yeah, the book that's coming out is about my work with Dr. King, and purposely not mentioning Salem because of the number of death threats. And even when we came here in North Carolina, we had a gang of car full of guys yelling at us. We know who you are, and we know why you're here, and you're not going to survive. And so even this Bible Belt little safe little community, we still had some little, some little stuff to have dealt with. But all in all, the joy you receive in serving the Lord when you come through all kinds of things, all kinds of death threats. When you come through, you don't look forward to those events, but when you come through and you know that you stayed focused on Jesus Christ and willing to suffer for Christ, not for yourself, not for ego, not for status, etc. You do it for Christ's sake. I don't say that lightly. I mean it. That's how you make it through. Is you're doing it for Christ's sake, and you keep going. And we've had things here right in North Carolina, and it's just interesting. It doesn't go away. But the Lord, the thing I sense is the Lord will now not let you go through a situation that He's not willing to walk through with you and bring you through according to His plan. And you trust that. You just trust that.
That's wonderful, man. I so appreciate your story. Thank you. Did you say you have a book coming out? You kind of just glossed over that real quickly.
Yeah, it's a fellow's writing. It's been 5 years in the making, or 6 years in the making. So I'm not rushing it. I did work with two witches in Salem, and we wrote a book in collaboration together. We sent it to 3 different publishers, and each one sent a letter back. If we publish this, they'll kill you, and we don't want to take responsibility for your being killed.
Wow, that's incredible. God's really taken you from area to area of opposition, and you've just been able to stand in His will and with gentleness and respect, right? It sounds like, just loving. You said like that 2-year period of just loving people, showing gentleness, respect, but always giving a reason for the hope that you have. That's unbelievable. I love it. But this one will be a bit longer. But just for making sure that we have something to offer that's not 18 hours long, because I could keep talking about this. It's wonderful. This is probably a good time to kind of transition out. But guys, this was great. Ken, thank you so much for your time. And if you're up for it, I'd love to have you guys. Well, Kirk, absolutely, but have you back at some point and continue on the conversation.
Yeah, it's good to talk with you, Dad.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, Kirk.
Well,
you kept
you're welcome. You're very welcome.
Ken, you kept you text Kirk and you with scripture verses and so on, and Kirk would tell me about it, and we as we talked, we're like, well, I think we need to bring him into the conversation. This is so thanks for being involved.
It's my honor and pleasure.